Here is a strange thing to consider before you close your eyes. The country you may be lying in right now, or thinking about right now, did not exist for most of human history, and yet it was built entirely on land that had already been lived on, farmed, sung about, and fought over for more than 10,000 years before anyone wrote the word America down. 250 years sounds like a long time. It is not. It is barely 3 long lifetimes, laid end to end. And somehow, in that short span, a patchwork of colonies became an idea, and the idea became a nation, and the nation became something the whole world watches, argues about, and cannot look away from. So let yourself settle into the mattress now. Let your shoulders drop an inch further than they already have. There is nothing to do tonight except listen, and let the centuries drift by like something seen from a train window, half lit, softly blurring. You do not need to remember any of it. You only need to let it wash over you. Slowly, the way a story is told to someone who is already halfway into sleep. We should begin before the beginning, in a place that had no name yet, on a continent that had no need of one. Long before any ship crossed the Atlantic, with the intention of arriving here, human beings had already been living across this land for thousands of years. Most archaeologists and historians believe that the ancestors of native peoples arrived in the Americas via a land bridge connecting Siberia and Alaska sometime during the last ice age, likely more than 15,000 years ago, though the exact timeline remains genuinely debated among scholars. Over the millennia that followed, hundreds of distinct nations and cultures rose across the continent. The ancestral Puebloans built multi-story dwellings into cliff faces in what is now the American Southwest. The Mississippian culture constructed enormous earthen mounds, including the city of Cahokia near present-day St. Louis, which, at its height around the year 1000, may have held a population larger than London had at the same time. Along the northeastern woodlands, the Haudenosaunee, often called the Iroquois Confederacy, developed a system of governance among 5 and later 6 nations that some historians believe later influenced ideas about federalism among the very colonists who would eventually displace them. None of this is a footnote. It is the actual beginning of the story, the long, quiet centuries before anyone in Europe knew this land existed at all. And then, in 1492, everything changed. Not because a new continent was discovered, it was already fully inhabited, but because 2 worlds that had been entirely separate for thousands of years suddenly touched each other. Christopher Columbus, an Italian navigator sailing for the Spanish crown, believed he had found a western route to Asia. He had not. He had landed in the Bahamas, and what followed was a slow, uneven, often brutal process historians now call the Columbian Exchange. Plants, animals, ideas, and diseases moving in both directions across the ocean. Smallpox, measles, and other Old World diseases, to which indigenous populations had no immunity, spread with catastrophic speed, and many historians believe disease killed far more native people in the following century than any war or massacre, though exact numbers remain difficult to establish and are still debated. Here's where it gets interesting, though, because the story most people think they know, Columbus landing, and then somehow, directly, the United States beginning, skips over more than a century of other attempts, failures, and quiet persistence. Spanish explorers pushed into Florida and the Southwest, French traders moved along the St. Lawrence and later down through the Mississippi Valley, and English colonists, arriving late to the competition, kept trying and kept failing in ways that rarely make it into the tidy version of the story. Consider Roanoke. In 1587, a group of English settlers established a colony on an island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. Their leader, John White, sailed back to England for supplies, but the war between England and Spain delayed his return for 3 years. When he finally came back in 1590, the colony was empty. The only clue was a single word carved into a post: Croton, the name of a nearby island and allied indigenous group. What actually happened to the settlers has never been definitively established, and to this day it remains one of the genuine open questions in early American history. Think about that for a moment. An entire colony simply gone, and no one alive today knows exactly why. It took another 20 years before English colonization actually stuck. In 1607, a group of settlers under the Virginia Company established Jamestown in what is now Virginia, and it very nearly failed too. The early years were catastrophic. Disease, starvation, and conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy killed the overwhelming majority of the original settlers within the first few years. What saved the colony in the end was not gold, which the settlers had come hoping to find, but tobacco. A settler named John Rolfe began cultivating a milder strain of tobacco around 1612, and it became wildly profitable back in England. Rolfe later married Pocahontas, the daughter of the Powhatan leader Wahunsenakaw, a relationship often romanticized in later American storytelling, but one that occurred within a much more complicated and often violent context of negotiation, captivity, and diplomacy between two peoples with radically different understandings of land and belonging. And then, in 1619, two things happened in Virginia within the same year that would echo across the following 2.5 centuries. The colony held its first meeting of an elected assembly, the House of Burgesses, an early seed of representative government in the English colonies. And that same year, a Dutch ship brought approximately 20 enslaved Africans to Jamestown, the beginnings of a system of forced labor that would become chattel slavery, an institution that would eventually touch nearly every corner of American economic and political life for the next 2 centuries, and whose consequences the country is, in many ways, still working through today. Meanwhile, further north, a different kind of colony was forming for different reasons entirely. In 1620, a group of English separatists, later called Pilgrims, sailed on a ship called the Mayflower, seeking a place where they could practice their religion outside the control of the Church of England. Before they even landed, they drafted the Mayflower Compact, a short agreement establishing that they would govern themselves by majority rule, a small but meaningful early experiment in self-governance. Their first winter in Plymouth was devastating. Roughly half of the settlers died. They survived largely because of assistance from local Wampanoag people, particularly a man named Tisquantum, often known as Squanto, who had learned English years earlier after being kidnapped and taken to Europe, and who returned to find that disease had wiped out nearly his entire community. The following autumn, in 1621, the surviving colonists and members of the Wampanoag shared a harvest celebration, an event later mythologized as the first Thanksgiving. though the holiday as it is celebrated today was formalized much later, largely in the 19th century. Over the following decades, English colonization spread along the Atlantic coast, eventually forming 13 distinct colonies, each with its own charter, economy, and character. New England colonies built their economies around fishing, shipbuilding, and small farming, and their communities were often organized tightly around Puritan religious life. The middle colonies, including Pennsylvania, founded by the Quaker William Penn in 1682 as an experiment in religious tolerance, developed more diverse populations and economies. The southern colonies, with their longer growing seasons, developed large plantation economies built increasingly on enslaved labor, particularly after the cultivation of rice, indigo, and later cotton took hold. And it's worth lingering, just for a moment, on how strange and precarious daily life actually was in these early colonies, because the version of colonial America that gets passed down often smooths over just how fragile everything was. Winters could be lethal. Crops failed without warning. Disease moved through small settlements with terrifying speed, since medicine at the time had almost no real understanding of germs or infection. In Massachusetts, fear and suspicion curdled into tragedy in 1692, when a wave of accusations in the town of Salem led to the execution of 20 people, mostly women, convicted of witchcraft based on testimony that today would be recognized as almost entirely unreliable. Born of fear, rivalry, and a genuine, if misplaced, belief in supernatural danger. It stands now as one of the clearest reminders in early American history of how easily a frightened community can turn its fear into violence against people who have done nothing at all. Elsewhere, the colonies were quietly developing something else, almost by accident, a habit of self-governance. Because the Atlantic crossing took, on average, 6 to 12 weeks, depending on weather and seasons. Colonial governments were, in practice, left to manage an enormous amount of their own daily affairs without much oversight from London. Town meetings in New England, elected assemblies in Virginia and elsewhere, local courts, local militias, all of it built up a kind of muscle memory of self-rule that would matter enormously later when the question of separating from Britain altogether finally arrived. Nobody planned this. It was simply what distance and slow communication produced, generation after generation, almost without anyone noticing it happening. It's worth pausing here, gently, to notice something. These colonies did not think of themselves as one country. They barely thought of themselves as connected to each other at all. A person born in Massachusetts in the early 1600s would have had almost nothing in common, culturally or economically, with someone born in South Carolina at the same time. The idea that these separate colonies would one day fuse into a single nation would have struck most of them as almost unimaginable. And yet, slowly, almost invisibly, shared experiences began to bind them together. Shared conflicts with indigenous nations, shared trade relationships, and eventually, a shared war. That war was not the revolution. It came earlier, and it set the stage for everything that followed. Between 1754 and 1763, Britain and France fought what is known in America as the French and Indian War, part of a larger global conflict called the 7 Years' War. Britain won, gaining control of French territory in North America, but the war left the British government deeply in debt. And here is the quiet hinge point that so much of American history turns on: to pay down that debt and to help cover the cost of maintaining troops in the colonies. The British Parliament began imposing a series of taxes directly on the colonists: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, without giving the colonies any representation in Parliament itself. This is where the phrase, "no taxation without representation," begins to take on real weight, not as an abstract slogan, but as a genuine grievance felt by merchants, farmers, and ordinary colonists who suddenly found their daily transactions taxed by a government 3,000 miles away that they had no voice in. Resentment built slowly through boycotts, pamphlets, and increasingly organized resistance. In 1770, tensions in Boston boiled over when British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonists, killing 5 people, an event colonial propagandists quickly labeled the Boston Massacre. Then, in 1773, in protest of a tax on tea and the East India Company's monopoly, a group of colonists disguised themselves and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor, an event later remembered as the Boston Tea Party. Britain responded with a set of punitive measures the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston's port and tightening royal control over Massachusetts. And here's the thing that often gets lost in the retelling: none of this at first was really about independence. Most colonists, even the angriest ones, still considered themselves loyal British subjects. What they wanted was to be treated as British subjects, with full rights, not as a separate and lesser category of people. Independence was not the plan. It became the only remaining option. In April of 1775, British troops marched toward Concord, Massachusetts, intending to seize colonial military supplies, and were met by colonial militia at Lexington and then Concord. Shots were exchanged. Historians still are not entirely certain who fired first, and it is often remembered simply as "the shot heard round the world," a phrase from a much later poem by Ralph Waldo Emerson. War had effectively begun even before anyone had formally declared it. For more than a year, the colonies fought without officially declaring independence, still hoping, in some quarters, for reconciliation. But by the summer of 1776, that hope had largely faded. A committee including Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston was tasked with drafting a formal declaration. Jefferson, then just 33 years old, wrote most of the document himself, drawing heavily on Enlightenment political philosophy, particularly the ideas of the English philosopher John Locke. On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence, which included the now famous words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And here is a tension worth sitting with quietly, because the country has been sitting with it ever since. Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote those words about equality and unalienable rights, owned more than 600 enslaved people over the course of his lifetime, and freed only a small number of them, mostly late in life or after his death. The gap between the ideals stated at the country's founding and the reality lived by millions of people within it was there from the very first sentence, and it would take nearly 2 more centuries, and enormous suffering, and before the nation began to seriously close that gap. This isn't a detour from the story. It is the story running underneath everything else quietly for the next 250 years. The war itself dragged on for 8 difficult years. George Washington, a Virginia planter and veteran of the French and Indian War, was appointed commander of the Continental Army, a force that was often underfed, underpaid, and undersupplied compared to the professional British military. The winter of 1777 to 1778, spent at Valley Forge as Pennsylvania, is remembered as one of the war's lowest points, with soldiers suffering from cold, hunger, and disease, though it was also a period of intense training under the Prussian officer Baron von Steuben that helped professionalize the army. The war's turning point is often identified as the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, an American victory significant enough that it convinced France to formally ally with the fledgling United States, providing crucial military and financial support. Without French naval and military assistance, many historians believe the war might well have ended differently. It is worth remembering, too, that the Continental Army was never a single uniform force of eager patriots. It was a shifting, often reluctant collection of farmers, tradesmen, and laborers, many of whom served only short enlistments before returning home to their farms, leaving Washington to rebuild pieces of his army again and again throughout the war. Enslaved and free black men served on both sides of the conflict, some promised freedom by the British in exchange for military service, others fighting for the Continental Army in hopes that the language of liberty being spoken all around them might eventually be extended to include them too, a hope that for most would not be fulfilled for generations. Women, too, played roles rarely captured in the more familiar retelling of this war, managing farms and businesses in their husbands' absence, serving as nurses and cooks near the front lines, and in a small number of documented cases, disguising themselves as men in order to fight directly. The conflict finally concluded with the British surrender at Yorktown in 1781 and the Treaty of Paris signed in 1783 formally recognized American independence. But winning independence and building a functioning country turned out to be two very different problems. The first governing document, the Articles of Confederation, created a deliberately weak central government, largely because the former colonists were deeply suspicious of concentrated power after their experience with the British Crown. But that weakness quickly became a serious problem. The federal government under the Articles could not effectively tax, regulate trade between states, or maintain a reliable military. And by the mid-1780s, economic troubles and events like Shays' Rebellion, an armed uprising of indebted farmers in Massachusetts in 1786, convinced many leaders that a stronger central framework was needed. So, in the summer of 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia ostensibly to revise the Articles of Confederation and instead wrote an entirely new framework of government. The resulting constitution created a federal system with 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial, designed with checks and balances, intended to prevent any single branch from accumulating too much power. It was, in many ways, a document built out of compromise, some of it admirable, some of it deeply troubling. The most painful of these compromises was the Three-Fifths Clause, which counted enslaved people as three-fifths of a person for purposes of congressional representation and taxation, without granting them any actual rights. A mathematical formula built to satisfy competing political interests applied to human beings. The Constitution also initially lacked a Bill of Rights, which was added shortly after. In 1791, as the first 10 amendments, guaranteeing protections such as freedom of speech, religion, and the press, along with protections for the accused in criminal proceedings. George Washington was unanimously elected the first president under this new constitution in 1789, and he served 2 terms, deliberately stepping down afterward, a decision that established an unwritten norm of peaceful transfer of power that lasted, with a handful of contested moments, for well over 2 centuries. In his farewell address in 1796, Washington warned against the dangers of political factionalism and permanent foreign alliances, though, almost immediately after he left office, the very factionalism he warned against began to define American politics, splitting into early political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, led respectively by figures like Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, who disagreed fundamentally about the proper size and role of the federal government. Alexander Hamilton, serving as the first Secretary of the Treasury, believed strongly in a robust federal government, a national bank, and an economy oriented toward manufacturing and commerce, modeled loosely on Britain's financial systems. Thomas Jefferson, by contrast, distrusted concentrated federal power and centralized banking, imagining instead a nation of independent small farmers, self-reliant and suspicious of distant authority. These were not abstract disagreements confined to polite dinner conversation. They shaped real policy fights over the national debt, over whether the federal government could charter a bank at all, and over how much power the Constitution actually granted to the government it had created. And here's the detail that tends to surprise people. This rivalry, which produced the country's first real political parties, was resolved not through some grand act of unity, but through the ordinary, often bitter give and take of politics, the same kind of disagreement. That, in one form or another, has continued in every generation since. Hamilton himself would die in 1804, killed in a duel with Vice President Aaron Burr, a strange and violent postscript to a rivalry that had by then already reshaped how the young government actually functioned. Let the pace slow here for a moment the way a river slows where it widens. Because the young country was still at this point a fragile and uncertain experiment. Nobody, watching it in 1790, could have promised it would still exist in 1799, let alone 250 years later. It survived its early decades through a combination of luck, compromise, and the sheer determination of people who mostly disagreed with each other about almost everything. The nation's territory expanded dramatically and quickly in the decades that followed. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson negotiated the Louisiana Purchase, buying roughly 828,000 square miles of territory from France for around $15 million, effectively doubling the size of the country in a single transaction. Napoleon Bonaparte, needing funds for wars in Europe and having lost interest in maintaining a North American empire, was willing to sell. Jefferson then commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore this vast new territory, and their expedition, which lasted from 1804 to 1806, relied heavily on the guidance of a young Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, who served as an interpreter, and helped the expedition survive and navigate lands her people had known intimately for generations. This period of expansion came at enormous cost to native nations, whose land was being claimed, purchased, and redistributed by a government they had no part in. And here's what nobody tells you quite clearly enough in the simplified version of this story. Westward expansion was not an empty landscape being filled in. It was an occupied landscape being taken, treaty by treaty, war by war, often through agreements that were later broken by the United States government itself. This pattern would repeat again and again over the following century, culminating in policies like the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson, which led to the forced relocation of tens of thousands of native people from the southeastern United States. The Cherokee removal in particular, which took place primarily in 1838 and 1839, became known as the Trail of Tears, and historians estimate that thousands of Cherokee people died during the forced march west from cold, disease, and exhaustion. By the 1840s, this drive to expand westward had acquired its own name and its own sense of moral certainty. Newspaper editors and politicians began speaking of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was somehow fated, even divinely ordained, to expand across the entire continent. It was a phrase that made conquest sound inevitable rather than chosen, and it helped justify the annexation of Texas in 1845. And then, following the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, the acquisition of a vast stretch of territory that would eventually become California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of several other present-day states, formalized through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The discovery of gold in California in 1848, just days before that treaty was signed, triggered a massive rush of settlers westward the following year, transforming a sparsely populated territory into a booming, chaotic society within a matter of months. Think for a moment about what that kind of rapid transformation actually looks like on the ground. Towns appeared almost overnight. Fortunes were made and lost within a single season. And for the indigenous nations whose homelands lay directly in the path of this expansion, the arrival of hundreds of thousands of new settlers meant an accelerating cycle of broken treaties, violent conflict, and displacement that would continue, in one form or another, for the rest of the century. It is one of the harder truths sitting underneath the more romantic frontier imagery that later found its way into American folklore. The covered wagons, the homesteads, the sense of open possibility. For the people already living there, that same open land was not empty at all. It was simply being taken from them, piece by piece, and the country's growing prosperity in these decades was built, in no small part, on that quiet and often unacknowledged loss. Alongside this expansion, the institution of slavery deepened rather than faded, particularly after the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793, which made processing short staple cotton dramatically faster and, rather than reducing the need for enslaved labor as some had hoped, instead made cotton enormously profitable and entrenched slavery even more firmly across the South. By the 1850s, the United States was, in many ways, two increasingly incompatible economies and cultures sharing one government, an industrializing North, increasingly opposed to slavery's expansion, and a South whose entire economic and social structure depended on it. Tensions built for decades through a series of uneasy compromises. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 attempted to maintain a balance between free and slave states as new territories joined the Union. The Compromise of 1850, following the Mexican-American War, which added vast new territories including California, attempted another uneasy balance, including a stricter Fugitive Slave Act that outraged many in the North. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed new territories to decide the slavery question by popular vote, leading to violent conflict in Kansas that became known as Bleeding Kansas, a preview of the larger war to come. Think, for a moment, about what it must have felt like to live through those years watching a country slowly, visibly tearing along a seam that had been there since its very founding. In 1857, the Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott versus Sanford ruled that Black Americans, whether enslaved or free, could not be considered citizens, further inflaming a nation already at its breaking point. And then, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln, a lawyer from Illinois, who opposed the expansion of slavery, was elected president, and within months, several Southern states began seceding from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. The Civil War began in April of 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and it would become, by a significant margin, the deadliest conflict in American history. Historians estimate that around 750,000 soldiers died, along with an unknown number of civilians, in a war that pitted region against region, and often, quite literally, family against family. Lincoln's primary stated goal at the outset was preserving the Union rather than abolishing slavery. But as the war progressed, and as the moral and strategic weight of slavery became impossible to ignore, his position shifted. In September of 1862, following the Union victory at Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American military history, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and on January 1st, 1863, it took effect, declaring enslaved people in Confederate territory to be free. Though it did not immediately free enslaved people in border states that remained loyal to the Union, the war turned decisively in the summer of 1863 at the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, where Union forces repelled a Confederate invasion of the North in a three-day battle that resulted in tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. Later that year, at the dedication of a cemetery on the battlefield, Lincoln delivered a speech lasting barely 2 minutes, now known as the Gettysburg Address, which included the line that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The war finally ended in April of 1865, when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Just days later, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, dying the following morning, never seeing the peace he had worked so hard to secure. The years after the war, known as Reconstruction, attempted to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people into full citizenship. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, formally abolished slavery throughout the United States. The 14th Amendment, in 1868, granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to all people born in the United States. The 15th Amendment in 1870 prohibited denying the right to vote based on race. For a brief period, often called Radical Reconstruction, Black Americans in the South voted in significant numbers, held elected office at every level of government, including in Congress, and built new schools and institutions almost from nothing. But this progress was met with fierce, often violent resistance, including a wave of terror carried out by groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, founded in 1865, which used intimidation and murder to suppress Black political participation. The federal commitment to enforcing Reconstruction gradually weakened through the 1870s, and the disputed presidential election of 1876 was ultimately resolved through an informal political bargain, in which federal troops were withdrawn from the South entirely, effectively ending federal enforcement of Reconstruction. What followed was decades of segregation, disenfranchisement through devices like poll taxes and literacy tests, and racial terror enforced through Jim Crow laws across the South, a system that would remain largely intact for nearly a century. But here's something worth pausing on gently before moving forward, because it is easy to think of history as a straight line, one event simply causing the next. It rarely works that way. Instead, it moves more like weather, pressure building in one place, sense nouns, release happening somewhere else, entirely new patterns forming from old ones that never fully resolved. In the decades following the Civil War, the country industrialized at a staggering pace. Railroad trains connected the coasts with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 at Promontory Summit, Utah, built largely through the labor of Chinese immigrants on the western portion and Irish immigrants on the eastern portion, working under often brutal and dangerous conditions. Industrial titans like John D. Rockefeller in oil and Andrew Carnegie in steel amassed enormous fortunes, while millions of ordinary workers, including large numbers of new immigrants, arriving from Europe through places like Ellis Island, which opened in 1892, labored in factories and mines under conditions that would seem almost unimaginable by today's standards. This era, often called the Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain, was marked by extraordinary wealth existing alongside extraordinary poverty, and it eventually gave rise to labor movements, strikes, and, gradually, a set of political reforms known as the Progressive Era, which pushed for regulations on corporations, improved labor conditions, food safety laws, and eventually, in 1920, the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. Following decades of organizing by suffragists, including figures like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, neither of whom lived to see it ratified. But here's what nobody quite emphasizes enough about this period: the sheer scale of human movement involved. Between roughly 1880 and 1920, more than 20 million immigrants arrived in the United States, many from Italy, Poland, Russia, and other parts of Southern and Eastern Europe, crowding into tenement housing in rapidly growing cities like New York and Chicago. Many arrived with almost nothing, carrying only what could fit into a single trunk, and found work in garment factories, steel mills, and meatpacking plants. often for wages that barely covered rent and food. And around the same time, a separate but related movement was beginning within the country itself. Starting around 1910 and continuing for decades afterward, in what historians now call the Great Migration, roughly 6 million Black Americans left the rural South for cities in the North, Midwest, and West, seeking better economic opportunity and escape from the daily violence and legal discrimination of the Jim Crow South. Both movements, arriving from overseas and moving within the country, reshaped the culture, the music, the food, and the very sound of American cities in ways still visible today. The early 20th century brought the country into global affairs in ways it had largely avoided before. The United States entered World War I in 1917. After years of trying to remain neutral, tipped in part by German submarine attacks on civilian ships, and the interception of the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico against the United States. American involvement, though relatively brief, helped tip the balance on the Western Front, and the war ended in November of 1918. The 1920s brought a period of cultural transformation and economic boom, sometimes called the Roaring Twenties, along with the deeply painful era of Prohibition, beginning in 1920, which banned the sale of alcohol nationwide, and, rather than eliminating drinking, largely drove it underground and fueled organized crime. It was also the era of the Harlem Renaissance, a flourishing of Black literary, artistic, and musical achievement centered in New York City, with figures like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston producing work that reshaped American culture. And then, in October of 1929, the stock market crashed, triggering the Great Depression, the most severe economic downturn in modern American history. Unemployment climbed to roughly 25% at its worst point. Banks failed by the thousands, and families across the country lost homes, savings, and, in many cases, hope itself. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, elected in 1932, responded with a sweeping set of programs known as the New Deal, which included Social Security, established in 1935 to provide retirement income, along with public works, projects that employed millions of Americans building roads, bridges, and parks that still exist today. Whether the New Deal alone ended, the Depression remains genuinely debated among economists and historians. Many believe it was ultimately the massive economic mobilization of World War II that fully pulled the country out of economic crisis. The suffering of this period was compounded in the central and southern plains by an environmental disaster largely of human making. Years of intensive farming had stripped away the native grasses that once held the soil in place, and when a severe, prolonged drought settled over the region beginning around 1930, the exposed topsoil simply lifted into the air, carried by the wind in enormous, choking clouds that could turn day into darkness within minutes. This became known as the Dust Bowl, and it drove hundreds of thousands of families, particularly from Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas, to abandon farms that had been in their families for generations and migrate westward, most often to California, in search of any work at all. Many of these families, often labeled collectively as Okies, a term used both descriptively and as an insult, faced discrimination and exploitation even after reaching California, working as itinerant laborers in the state's vast agricultural fields for wages that barely allowed survival. The writer John Steinbeck captured this migration in his novel The Grapes of Wrath, published in 1939, which drew both acclaim and considerable controversy for its unflinching portrayal of the hardship these families endured. That war began for the United States on December 7, 1941, when Japan launched a surprise attack on the naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, killing over 2,000 people and drawing the country into a conflict it had, until then, largely watched from a distance. The following years reshaped not just America but the entire world. American industry converted almost entirely to wartime production. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, often symbolized by the cultural figure of Rosie the Riveter, and, in a decision that remains one of the most consequential and morally fraught in American history, the United States developed and then used atomic weapons against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, killing well over 100,000 people, many instantly, with many more dying afterward from injuries and radiation exposure. Japan surrendered shortly after, bringing the war to its end. The war's aftermath reshaped the country almost as much as the fighting itself had. In 1944, Congress passed the GI Bill, which offered returning veterans funding for education, low-interest home loans, and unemployment benefits, helping fuel an enormous expansion of the American middle class through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. Though these benefits were often, in practice, far less accessible to Black veterans due to discriminatory lending and enrollment practices in many parts of the country. Suburbs expanded rapidly. Highways spread across the landscape, following the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, and a period of broad, if unevenly distributed, economic prosperity settled over much of American life, one that would later be looked back on with a certain wistfulness. Even as the country's underlying racial and economic divisions remained largely unresolved beneath the surface of that prosperity. Here's something worth sitting with quietly, the way you might sit with a difficult thought right before sleep, letting it exist without needing to resolve it. The same scientific curiosity, the same human ingenuity that had, over centuries, produced telescopes and vaccines and printing presses, had also, in this moment, produced a weapon capable of erasing a city in an instant. Progress, it turns out, is not automatically good or bad. It is simply powerful, and what a nation chooses to do with that power says as much about its character as anything else in its history. The years following World War II ushered in what historians call the Cold War, a decades-long period of tension, ideological competition, and occasional direct proxy conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, two nations that had been uneasy allies against Germany and now became the world's dominant rival superpowers. This period brought the Korean War in the early 1950s, the ever-present anxiety of nuclear conflict, and, in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, a 13-day standoff over Soviet missiles placed in Cuba that brought the world arguably closer to nuclear war than at any other point in history, resolved only through careful, tense diplomacy between President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Domestically, this same era saw one of the most important moral reckonings in American history finally reach a turning point. The civil rights movement building on decades of organizing by Black Americans, gained enormous momentum in the 1950s and 60s. In 1954, the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, overturning the earlier separate but equal doctrine established in 1896. In 1955, Rosa Parks, a Black woman in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to give up her bus seat to a white passenger, sparking a bus boycott that lasted over a year and helped launch the national career of a young minister named Martin Luther King Jr. King would go on to lead the movement through nonviolent protest, most famously articulated in his "I Have a Dream" speech delivered in August of 1963 during the March on Washington, in which he said, "I have a dream that my four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." The movement's efforts culminated in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which dismantled many of the legal barriers that had suppressed Black voting for nearly a century. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, in April of 1968, a loss that shook the entire country. But here is the gentle wave worth noticing before we move further. History rarely resolves cleanly. Even as legal segregation ended, its economic and social consequences did not simply disappear. And the country continued and continues even now to work through what full equality actually looks like in practice, not just in law. The same decades that carried the civil rights movement also carried the country into space, quite literally, spurred in part by Cold War competition. After the Soviet Union launched the satellite Sputnik in 1957, the United States poured enormous resources into its space program. President Kennedy, in 1961, committed the nation to landing a man on the moon before the decade's end, and on July 20th, 1969, astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first human being to walk on the lunar surface, famously saying, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." As roughly 600 million people around the world watched on television, an audience larger than almost any single event in human history up to that point. 6 Apollo missions in total landed astronauts on the moon between 1969 and 1972. And then, almost as quickly as the effort had begun, crewed lunar missions stopped entirely, a reminder that even the grandest human achievements are often driven as much by competition and circumstance as by pure curiosity, and can fade in urgency just as suddenly as they once rose. The 1960s and 70s also brought deep social upheaval, including widespread protest against the Vietnam War, a conflict that ultimately claimed the lives of over 58,000 American service members and an even larger number of Vietnamese civilians and combatants, and which many historians view as a profound turning point in how Americans related to their own government's honesty and judgment. That erosion of trust deepened further with the Watergate scandal, which began with a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in 1972 and eventually revealed a wide pattern of abuse of power within President Richard Nixon's administration, leading to his resignation in August of 1974. the only time in American history a president has resigned from office. The 1980s brought their own particular character to American life, shaped in large part by President Ronald Reagan, who championed reduced taxes, deregulation, and a renewed, assertive stance against the Soviet Union, a period sometimes described as a return to conservative values after the social upheavals of the preceding 2 decades. It was also, quietly and then not so quietly, a decade shadowed by the emergence of the AIDS epidemic, which, by the mid 1980s, had begun killing thousands of Americans, disproportionately gay men in its early years, met initially by a federal government response that many historians and public health experts now regard as dangerously slow, a painful reminder that scientific understanding and political will do not always move at the same pace as suffering itself. The final decades of the 20th century brought the end of the Cold War itself, as the Soviet Union gradually weakened and finally dissolved in 1991, leaving the United States as the world's sole remaining superpower, at least for a time. In November of 1989, the Berlin Wall, which had divided East and West Germany since 1961, came down, an event watched with astonishment around the world, as a symbol of division that had felt permanent simply crumbled within a matter of hours. This period also saw the rapid rise of personal computing and, later, the internet, technologies that would reshape daily life more thoroughly and more quickly than almost any invention before them, connecting the country and eventually the world in ways the founders, arguing by candlelight in Philadelphia, could never have imagined. And then, on September 11th, 2001, 19 terrorists affiliated with the extremist group Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 commercial airplanes, crashing 2 into the World Trade Center towers in New York City, 1 into the Pentagon near Washington, and a 4th into a field in Pennsylvania, after passengers attempted to retake control of the aircraft. Nearly 3,000 people were killed that morning, and the attacks reshaped American foreign policy, domestic security, and the country's sense of its own vulnerability for decades afterward, leading to prolonged military engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq. The 21st century has continued to unfold with its own chain of consequences, each event opening new questions the way earlier centuries did. The 2008 financial crisis, triggered in large part by risky lending practices and the collapse of major financial institutions, produced the most severe economic downturn since the Great Depression and prompted significant government intervention to stabilize the banking system. The election of Barack Obama that same year made him the first black president in American history, a moment that carried enormous symbolic weight given everything that had come before it. From the Three-Fifths Clause to Jim Crow to the Civil Rights Movement, and more recently, the COVID-19 pandemic, which reached the United States in early 2020, brought the country's public health systems, economy, and social fabric under strain, unlike anything experienced in generations, killing over 1 million Americans according to official counts, a number that still occasionally seems difficult to fully absorb. And in these most recent years, the country has continued wrestling with questions that, in some form, stretch all the way back to its founding, about who truly belongs, about how power should be shared, about how quickly change should come and who gets to decide its pace. New technologies including artificial intelligence systems capable of holding conversations very much like this one, have begun raising fresh questions about work, truth, and connection that no earlier generation of Americans ever had to consider. And the slow, accumulating effects of a changing climate have started reshaping coastlines, fire seasons, and agricultural patterns in ways scientists have been warning about for decades, adding yet another long, unfolding chapter to a story that has never really stopped moving. It's worth pulling back now, gently, the way you might step back from a painting to see the whole shape of it rather than just the brushstrokes. What connects all of this? The Ice Age migrations, the tobacco fields, the printing of the Declaration, the trains crossing the plains, the moon landing, the towers falling, is something surprisingly simple. It is the same basic human tension, playing out again and again across 250 years. The tension between the ideal of what a nation says it wants to be and the much messier, much harder reality of actually becoming it. Every generation inherits both the unfinished promises and the unresolved wounds of the ones before it. And every generation adds its own chapter, for better or worse, to the same long, unfinished story. There is something quietly remarkable in the fact that you, lying there right now, are simply the most recent moment in that chain. Whatever country you are in, whatever the news says tonight, whatever tomorrow will bring, none of it happened by accident, and none of it is finished. History is not something that happened. It is something that is still happening, slowly, all around you, even in the stillness of this exact moment. But that is a thought for tomorrow, not for now. For now, let it all go soft, the way it's already beginning to. All those centuries, all those names and dates can simply rest now, the way you are resting, sinking slightly further into the mattress with every breath you let out. There is nothing left to hold on to tonight. No timeline to follow, no thread to keep track of. Just the weight of the blanket, just the quiet of the room, just your own breath slower now, moving in and out without you needing to think about it at all. The body settles, the mind loosens, darkness soft and close, still.